Good morning. Our scripture this morning is from Psalm 90, verses 1 through 6 and 13 through 17. O God, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn us back to dust and say, "Turn back, you mortals." For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it is past, or like a watch in the night. You sweep them away. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and it is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. Turn, O God. How long? Have compassion on your servants. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, so that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be manifest in your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the sovereign our God be upon us, and prosper for us the work of our hands. Oh, prosper the work of our hands. May these words be to us our light and life. So, 500 years ago, next Tuesday, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. 95 Theses, a list of errors into which he thought the church had fallen. But in nailing them to the door, he is credited with starting the Reformation. What's the big deal? In the simplest terms, Martin Luther's call for reform of the Roman Catholic Church led to the first major division in the Western Church, into Catholics and Protestants. But that initial schism turned into the split that keeps on splitting, until today we have, in addition to our two denominations, the Presbyterian Church USA and the United Church of Christ, maybe 9,000 Protestant denominations in the United States alone. So that's a big deal, I guess. But that's not even the half of it. The Reformation's influence on today's society is pervasive. Our thinking on family, economy, work, theology, sexuality, and more all reflect the influence of the Reformation thought. And even in those socio-political, economic areas where modern life has undergone the most dramatic changes, the case can be made for the groundwork having been laid by the reformers. Luther's theological reform centered on a basic idea that faith alone is required for our salvation. And where do we get that faith? From the Bible alone. Okay, but wait. By Luther's day, the Catholic Church had accrued 1,500 years of biblical commentary and doctrinal interpretation, as well as church law regarding clergy, and it had the political power of excommunication in an overwhelmingly Christian society. So, granted, the Bible has authority, but what about the authority of the church? Doesn't that count for something? Nope, said Luther and his fellow reformers, if it's not in the Bible, it's out. Okay, so monasticism, out. Celibacy, out. Married clergy, in. Birth rate, up. Prior to the Reformation, the highest ideal for a Christian was to be called to the monastic life. But Martin Luther's notion of the priesthood of all believers demolished that hard distinction between the temporal and the spiritual realms that had dominated medieval thought. And with the abolition of monasticism, a life of service could take shape in the ordinary circumstances of work and family life. In fact, Luther declared, secular life is itself a calling. This revaluation of work and marriage provided religious justification for the complete secularization of Western culture and society. That's a pretty big statement, so let me repeat it. Just on those two counts, the revaluation of work and marriage, the Reformation provided the religious justification for the complete secularization of Western culture and society. But wait, there's more. The Reformation also provided an ideal setting for capitalism to flourish. Previously, the Old Testament prohibition against usury made money lending problematic. But John Calvin argued that the European cultural context was sufficiently different from ancient Israel that usury wasn't necessarily wrong. The ability to lend money and charge interest was crucial to the development of capitalism. And the effect on politics? With the aid of the printing press, Luther was able to reach a much wider audience than those strolling by the church door in Wittenberg on that long ago October day. Luther and his fellow reformers, Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, were quick to make use of this new communication technology to spread their ideas. And remember what I said earlier about the birth rate going up? Well, it was a good thing that that happened, because the Reformation also sparked religious wars that raged across Europe and redrew national borders. By the time the Peace of Westphalia rolled around in 1648, millions of soldiers and civilians had died from battles, massacres, and war-caused famine and disease. Conservative estimates hover around 6 million deaths. The higher estimates claim 16 million. The determination of our founding fathers to separate church and state is a direct outgrowth of European exhaustion from religiously inspired wars. All this from a desire to purify the church, and based on two theological claims: faith alone, sola fide, and Bible alone, sola scriptura. Well, now I've done it. I was determined not to deliver a lecture, but slipping into Latin crossed over the line. But really, though, how could you expect a professor of historical theology to talk about something that so monumentally influenced the modern world and not give at least a little context? Luther, Luther, Luther. Lots of talk about Martin Luther. What about Calvin or Zwingli or Knox? Or where's the Reformed side in all of this? And I've totally left out the issue of interpretation. If we're all supposed to read the Bible on our own, what happens when we disagree? Short and only semi-facetious answer: we break off and start a new denomination. And we're back to Luther. Why Luther? Despite all of the forerunners, of course, there were many of them, the date of the Reformation is fixed at October 31st, 1517. And the precipitating act, the nailing of those 95 theses, was the act of one man, Martin Luther. And that's how we often do history, isn't it? History by biography. We focus on the life of a man, less often a woman, and we tell that person's story. We use the story to talk about events, but it's all in relation to that person. And so, Reformation Sunday, we tell Luther's biography. We tell stories of the monk who, in an era when eternal damnation really meant something, anguished over his personal salvation. He accepted the medieval teaching that God is gracious to those who do what is within them. But Luther was tormented by the question, how do I know if I've done enough? So he pored over the Bible, looking for help, and at the risk of reductionism, he determined that salvation is not based on what we do, not on our works, our merits, or anything that we do designed to win God's favor. Salvation is something that we can not influence in any way. It is wholly the work of a gracious God. And thus the famous litany, justification by faith through grace apart from the works of the law. You can remember it better if you sing-song it. Justification by faith through grace apart from the works of the law. That was Marilyn Salmon, Barbara. And so Luther's spiritual biography becomes the lens through which we study the Reformation. His reasoned argument on biblical authority is condensed into a rejection of celibacy and becomes the story of Luther's marriage to Katharina von Bora. The complexity of the medieval penitential system boils down to Luther's rant against the sale of indulgences. Luther. We're left with the implication that the actions of a single man on a single day launched a singular resistance movement against a corrupt institution. By the actions of this one man, the world was transformed. History by biography, the one against the many. But if this is the only way we remember our history, then our view of social change, of resistance, of what's possible in the world will be hopelessly blunted. Martin Luther was an anomaly, we can tell ourselves. He did it all by himself. How can I compete? Who am I to take on the dominant systems of the day? I'm no Martin Luther. And that's the problem with history by biography. It leaves too many people out. And I don't just mean Calvin and Zwingli and a dozen other famous names of the Reformation. If I added any of those, I'd still be doing history as biography. But there's another way of doing history, another way of learning from the Reformation, and it's a lot more helpful to us today. So let's change gears for a moment. Think about the resistance in World War II. There's no equivalent to Martin Luther's story. No one person, one act that we can point to and say to ourselves, that's the precise time and place where it began, and that's the person who got it going. Certainly we have all learned the names of some who were in the resistance. Courageous men and women who committed extraordinary acts of espionage and sabotage or rescue. But there are so many more names that we don't know. There was no 95 Theses moment. It was a moment of grave peril, but we can't point to one single event. The resistance movement of World War II was just that. It was a movement. People who were called to act, called individually, called to organize into cells, called to rise up right where they were and resist evil. This is a different way to do history. History not as biography of the one, but history as movement, a history of the many. It's important that we celebrate a singular event that took place 500 years ago, sure. But it's also important to focus on the movement that became the Reformation. That movement included peasants and princes, scholars and students, women, yes, women, because we finally got around to finding them. The power of liberation movements, like the civil rights and anti-war movements of the last century, is that they are the work of many. All liberation movements have their heroes, of course. But for all of you in this room who participated in those great movements of the last century, and for all of those in this room who know people who did, you know that liberation, resistance, is too important to be left up to the few. Liberation has to be the work of the people. The problem with history as biography is that it encourages us to think that history is made by other people, important people. The power of history as movement is that it can make room for all of us to take part. Every one of us can take a stand. Every one of us can do something. We make history. We make it with Martin Luther by taking a stand, with Rosa Parks by taking a seat. We take it. We make history when we leave a record for future generations. We leave a record so that no one looking back on this time can say, "Why did no one speak out?" The Reformation movement began as a theological crisis that spilled into every aspect of Western life, including the social and the political. We stand today in a social and political crisis that is spilling into every aspect of our faith. Faith calls us to stand with scientists on behalf of our planet. Faith calls us to stand with the immigrant and the refugee. Faith calls us to stand for racial justice and an end to white privilege. Faith calls us to stand for a living wage and basic health care. Faith calls us to stand for negotiated peace, not nuclear threats. Faith calls us to stand for a functional government that safeguards the common good. Faith calls us to speak truth to power, to name lies when we hear them. Faith calls us to stand with our children on behalf of the future. Next Tuesday, let's listen for the echo of Martin Luther's famous words. "Here I stand, I can do no more." By which he meant, I can't help it. I have to do this. This moment in history is ours. It doesn't belong to Martin Luther. It doesn't even belong to Martin Luther King. It's not a call to a single person. It's a call to each and every one of us. And it's not, "Here I stand," because resistance is not the work of just one, but of the many. It's, "Here we stand," because God help us, we can do no more.